On a quiet winter morning in 1989, the streets of Toronto carried the same cold bite they always had, but for one family, the season brought with it a silence that would last decades. On December 31st, just as the city prepared to welcome a new year, a 24-year-old woman named Nicole Morin vanished from her high-rise apartment building in Etobicoke. She had been a bright, vibrant young woman, an only child, beloved by her mother, and known in her neighborhood as warm and kind-hearted. She was getting ready to meet a friend that morning to go swimming, carrying with her a small beach bag, dressed in her bathing suit beneath her clothes. But somewhere between her front door and the lobby elevator, she disappeared without a trace. Nicole's life up to that point had been ordinary but happy. She lived with her mother in the apartment, had friends who described her as dependable and joyful, and was the kind of person who seemed grounded despite her youth. Nothing in her life suggested turmoil. Nothing suggested she would have reason to disappear on her own. It was around 11 a.m. when she spoke to her friend on the intercom, agreeing to meet downstairs. That was the last confirmed communication anyone had with her. She never arrived at the lobby. She never met her friend. She never came home. The building itself was the kind of sprawling high-rise typical of Toronto's suburbs in the 1980s. Long, dim hallways, uniform apartment doors, the ever-humming elevators that carried people up and down all day. Nicole's journey should have been simple. Step out her front door, walk a short hallway, press the button, and ride down. Yet, in those few minutes, she was gone. Her mother reported her missing almost immediately, and soon the police were combing the apartment building, searching stairwells, maintenance rooms, storage lockers, and parking areas. Neighbors were questioned. Flyers were printed. Police divers searched a nearby reservoir, but nothing surfaced. Not a piece of clothing, not her bag, not her body. The Toronto police treated the case with urgency at first, but as the hours turned into days and then weeks, the investigation grew colder. Rumors began to swirl in the community. Some speculated she'd been abducted in the building itself, possibly lured or forced into a unit before she even made it to the elevator. Others believed she might have stepped outside, met with someone she knew, and disappeared willingly, though her family and friends dismissed that as impossible. Nicole had no history of running away, no signs of depression, no secret life that anyone could uncover. The building's security was far from what it is today. There were no cameras in the hallways, no systems that tracked movement, no digital trail to follow. Once Nicole walked out her apartment door, she entered a void of uncertainty. Police questioned dozens of residents, but no one could say for certain they saw her leave. It was as though the hallways themselves had swallowed her whole. As the investigation dragged on, media coverage grew. Nicole's smiling face was plastered across newspapers, television broadcasts, and missing person posters throughout Toronto. Her mother, devastated but determined, pleaded publicly for information. Each anniversary brought renewed calls for answers, but no breakthroughs ever came. One of the most haunting aspects of the case is the sheer banality of the setting. This wasn't a dark alley or an isolated highway. It was a residential building full of people going about their daily routines. Children played in the corridors, neighbors carried groceries, people rode the same elevators Nicole should have taken. How could someone vanish in such a public space without a single witness, without a single clue? For investigators, the frustration was overwhelming. They pursued countless tips over the years, At one point, they considered whether Nicole had fallen victim to a predator known to target young women in the area, but no link was ever established. In 2014, nearly 25 years later, Toronto police released a new age-progressed composite image showing what Nicole might look like as a woman in her late 40s. The hope was that someone, somewhere, might recognize her, but again, nothing. The case continues to weigh heavily on those who remember it. Nicole's mother never gave up hope. Even as years turned into decades, she believed her daughter might still be alive, somewhere waiting to be found. That kind of hope, against all odds, is both inspiring and heartbreaking. Theories still circulate in online forums and among amateur sleuths. Some argue Nicole must have been taken by someone she knew, perhaps lured out of the building willingly. Others insist it had to be a stranger, someone who seized the briefest of opportunities in the hallway or the elevator. But without evidence, without witnesses, it's all speculation. What makes Nicole's disappearance particularly chilling is the reminder of how fragile everyday routines can be. She wasn't hitchhiking. She wasn't in a risky situation. She wasn't walking alone late at night. She was simply leaving her apartment to go swimming with a friend. In the span of a few minutes, her life was erased from the world's view. The police still classify her case as an open investigation. Every so often, they revisit old evidence, re-interview witnesses, and review tips. Technology has advanced, but because there was so little physical evidence to begin with, there's little to test or reanalyze. In recent years, cold case units have looked again at the possibility of foul play within the building, wondering if Nicole might have crossed paths with someone who lived there. But after decades, memories fade, residents move away, and opportunities for resolution slip further out of reach. The tragedy of Nicole's disappearance is not only in the loss of her life, but in the hollow space it carved into her family's future. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone that should have been celebrated became another reminder of what was stolen. For her mother, waking up each day meant facing the silence of an apartment where her daughter's laughter once lived. For friends, it meant a lifetime of unanswered questions about the girl they once swam with, studied with, and laughed with. Today, Nicole Morin's name still appears on Canada's long list of missing persons. For those unfamiliar, it's just another name among many. But for her family and for Toronto, it's a symbol of the fragility of safety, the randomness of loss, and the enduring ache of not knowing. The building where she lived still stands, its elevators still carrying residents up and down. Each hallway still hums with the same fluorescent lights. Somewhere in those walls lies the memory of the day Nicole stepped out her door and vanished into history. The haunting part of this story is not just the disappearance, it's the silence that followed. Silence from witnesses, silence from evidence, silence from the truth itself. 30-plus years later, one question remains as piercing as ever. How does a young woman vanish in broad daylight in her own home without anyone seeing a thing? The answer, if it exists, is buried deep within the shadows of that building, waiting for someone to finally uncover it. Until then, Nicole's case remains one of Toronto's most haunting cold cases, a reminder that sometimes even the safest places can hold the darkest mysteries. In the late summer of 1992, the city of Calgary was basking in warm evenings, families spending time outside, children riding bicycles through suburban streets. Among them was a little girl named Andrea Atkinson, a 6-year-old whose laughter carried across her quiet neighborhood. She had blonde hair that shone under the streetlights and an energy that seemed boundless. Andrea lived with her parents in a modest home in the city's northeast, a place where neighbors knew each other by name and doors were often left unlocked. On the night of August 22nd, Andrea was playing outside with her friends. It was an ordinary Saturday evening, the kind that should have ended with tired children being called home for bed. Around 7:30 p.m., Andrea was seen near her home, riding her bike. She told her friends she was going to head back inside, but she never arrived. Within minutes, her absence was noticed, and the panic set in almost immediately. For her parents, those minutes stretched into hours of horror as they searched the neighborhood, calling her name into the fading summer light. The Calgary police launched an exhaustive search that night. Officers canvassed the streets, volunteers combed through parks, and helicopters scoured the area from above. Hundreds of people joined the search, driven by the urgency of finding a little girl who had only moments before been laughing with her friends, but Andrea had vanished. Her bicycle was found near her home, discarded as though she had simply stepped away. The days that followed were filled with anguish and mounting fear. Posters with Andrea's picture appeared across the city. Her parents made public appeals for her safe return, their voices cracking under the weight of unimaginable grief. Calgary had seen its share of crime, but the disappearance of a child in a safe suburban neighborhood sent waves of terror through the community. Parents held their children closer, doors that had once been left open were now locked tight, and the sense of security that defined those streets dissolved overnight. 9 days later, on August 31st, a discovery was made that confirmed every parent's worst nightmare. Andrea's body was found in a wooded area near a rural road outside the city. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The innocence of Calgary's northeast community was shattered in an instant. Investigators threw every resource they had into the case. They collected evidence from the crime scene, scoured for witnesses, and questioned anyone who had been in the area around the time Andrea vanished. Forensic science in the early 1990s was advancing, but still lacked the precision of today. DNA testing existed but was limited, and databases were not as comprehensive. The evidence collected was preserved, but investigators struggled to find a definitive suspect. The case grew colder with each passing year. Police received hundreds of tips, but each one dissolved into dead ends. Suspects were questioned, some were even arrested in unrelated cases, but nothing tied anyone directly to Andrea's murder. Detectives who worked the case described it as one that haunted them long after their shifts ended. Many of them had children of their own, and they could not shake the image of a 6-year-old girl whose life had been stolen. Andrea's parents were left to endure the unbearable task of living without answers. Every holiday brought renewed pain. Every anniversary of her disappearance reopened wounds that never healed. They worked tirelessly to keep Andrea's case in the public eye, refusing to let her memory fade into the background of unsolved files. The years stretched into decades, and Andrea's case became one of Calgary's most notorious unsolved murders. Yet, as time passed, technology began to offer new hope. Advances in DNA analysis provided investigators with tools they could only dream of. In 1992, cold case units revisited Andrea's file, carefully reviewing every piece of evidence preserved from the crime scene. The possibility of identifying her killer grew stronger, but as of today, no definitive match has been announced. The community, too, has never forgotten. Even decades later, those who lived in the neighborhood at the time remember the fear that swept through their streets. Parents who were children themselves in 1992 still talk about Andrea, about how their childhoods were altered by her disappearance and murder. It became a defining moment in the city's history, one that shifted how people thought about safety and trust in their communities. What makes Andrea's case especially haunting is the randomness of it all. A child playing near her own home in broad daylight should be safe, yet within minutes she was taken, and her life ended in the most brutal way imaginable. The sheer brazenness of the act suggests someone who was willing to risk everything, someone who either knew the area well or was driven by a compulsion so strong they couldn't stop themselves. For Andrea's parents, the not knowing remains the deepest wound. To bury a child is tragedy enough, but to do so without knowing who is responsible is an endless torment. Every time a new suspect makes headlines in Canada for similar crimes, Andrea's case is revisited, her parents wondering if this time, finally, they will hear the name of the person who destroyed their lives. Calgary has grown since 1992, its suburbs expanding, its population booming, yet in the quiet corners of its northeast, people still remember Andrea. Some remember the search parties. Others recall the hushed conversations among parents warning their children to never go out alone. And for those who lived through it, Andrea's name is spoken with both sorrow and fear, a reminder of how quickly innocence can be stolen. Decades later, her case remains unsolved. It sits among the files of the Calgary Police Service's Cold Case Unit, a reminder of the work that remains unfinished. The evidence still exists, preserved carefully, waiting for the day when technology or a confession finally unlocks the truth. Until then, the city waits, and Andrea's parents continue to carry the weight of not knowing. The haunting legacy of Andrea Atkinson's case lies not only in her tragic death, but in the shadow it cast over an entire community. For those who lived there, childhood ended on the day Andrea disappeared. Safety became a question mark. Trust became a fragile thing. And for Canada, it became another reminder that evil does not only lurk in dark alleys or distant cities, it can reach into the heart of a neighborhood and change it forever. In the fall of 1978, the city of Ottawa was alive with the crisp air of changing leaves, students filling the streets near universities, and the steady hum of a capital city moving through its routines. Among those students was 19-year-old Louise Ellis, a young woman full of promise, creativity, and ambition. She was studying at Carleton University, passionate about writing, and known among her friends for her warmth and curiosity about the world. Louise was someone who seemed destined for a future filled with possibility. But on November 23rd, 1978, her story turned into one of Canada's most enduring cold cases. That evening, Louise left her apartment to meet a friend. She never arrived. She never came back. It was as if the city itself had swallowed her whole. Her disappearance sent shockwaves through her circle of friends and family. Louise wasn't the kind of person to vanish without explanation. She was reliable, grounded, and deeply connected to her loved ones. When she failed to return home that night, alarm bells rang immediately. By the next day, her absence was reported to the police, and what began was a search that would stretch across weeks, then months, and eventually years without answers. Investigators quickly learned that Louise had left behind all her belongings, her clothing, her school books, her identification. There was no evidence she had planned to run away or start a new life. She had simply vanished between her apartment and her intended destination. Police scoured the route she would have taken, questioned her friends, classmates, and professors, and looked into her personal life for any hint of trouble. But nothing suggested foul play, and nothing suggested she had left willingly. The winter deepened, and with it, hope began to fade. No witnesses came forward with solid information. No physical evidence was found. Louise had stepped into the night and never returned. Her family was left with unbearable uncertainty, struggling to hold on to hope while fearing the worst. For her parents, the holidays that year were marked not by celebration, but by the hollow absence of their daughter's laughter. As the years passed, the case grew colder. Her disappearance became one of many unsolved files in the Ottawa police archives. But Louise's name was not forgotten. Friends and family continued to speak about her, to write about her, to remember the vibrant young woman who once filled classrooms and coffee shops with her presence. Her absence lingered like a shadow over the city, a reminder of how quickly and cruelly a life could be erased. In the 1990s, Louise's name would return to the headlines in a deeply unsettling twist. In 1992, a man named Brett Morgan, who had been convicted of multiple violent crimes, became a suspect in her disappearance. Morgan had a history of assault and had been linked to other violent cases in the Ottawa area. Detectives believed there might be a connection between him and Louise, but the evidence was thin. Without a body, without forensic proof, they could not bring charges. The suspicion remained, but it never hardened into a conclusion. The cruelest part of Louise's story is that her case remained unresolved for decades. For her loved ones, there was no closure, no place to grieve, no justice to cling to. She simply remained one of Ottawa's missing, a face on a poster, a name in a file, a memory frozen in time. Her story became a ghost that haunted not only her family, but also the wider community of Carleton students, many of whom carried with them the fear of how easily a person could vanish. Years later, when Canada began investing more heavily in cold case units and DNA analysis, Louise's case was revisited. But time is merciless in its erosion of evidence. Memories fade, physical traces degrade, and witnesses pass away. What might have been solvable in 1978 had slipped into the realm of speculation and silence. What lingers most is the sense of promise unfulfilled. Louise was only 19. She had dreams of becoming a writer, of sharing stories with the world, of living a life filled with creativity and connection. Instead, her name became a headline. Her story reduced to a mystery. The Ottawa community remembers her not only as a victim, but as a young woman who deserved more than to be remembered solely for her disappearance. For cold case investigators, Louise's file represents the kind of haunting puzzle that keeps them awake at night. She left behind no trail, no clear suspect, no resolution. Every so often, tips still arrive. Someone claiming to have heard something, someone recalling a detail from years past. But nothing has ever broken the silence of that November night. Today, more than 40 years later, Louise's story is still spoken in Ottawa. Her family continues to advocate for answers, holding on to the belief that one day someone will come forward or technology will reveal the truth. Until then, her absence remains a wound in the city's history. The most chilling aspect of Louise's case is its ordinariness. She was not walking in a dangerous part of town, not engaging in risky behavior. She was simply a student walking through familiar streets on her way to see a friend. In that short journey, she crossed paths with someone or something that changed the course of her life forever. Ottawa has grown and changed since 1978, but for those who remember, the cold air of that November still carries the echo of Louise's footsteps. Cut short, unfinished. Her story is one of the countless reminders that safety is sometimes an illusion, that beneath the surface of everyday life lies the possibility of tragedy. And for Louise Ellis, her unfinished journey still lingers, asking the same question that has haunted Canada for decades. What happened that night? And who knows the truth? In the summer of 1969, the city of Montreal was alive with music, culture, and the restless energy of a generation caught between tradition and change. It was the kind of place where the air felt heavy with possibility. But for the family of a young boy named Charles Horvath-Allan, Montreal would come to symbolize something much darker, an endless nightmare without answers. Charles was just 20 years old in 1989 when he traveled from his home in the United Kingdom to Canada. He had been raised partly in Canada, his family having lived there when he was younger, and now as a young man, he returned to experience it for himself. He wanted adventure, to see more of the world, to carve out a path of independence before committing to a career. He told his mother he would spend some time in British Columbia working odd jobs, camping and meeting people. Charles had a free spirit, and he carried with him the easy charisma that made him quick to befriend strangers. In May of that year, he arrived in Kelowna, a lakeside city in British Columbia, known for its beauty and its tight-knit community. He planned to stay at a local campground, living cheaply while he figured out his next move. He wrote to his mother, Denise, telling her of his plans and assuring her that he was safe. But by late May, his letters stopped, and after May 26, 1989, no one saw Charles again. His disappearance was not immediately treated with alarm. Charles was young, adventurous, and transient. It was easy to assume he had simply moved on, maybe traveling further into Canada or even across the border into the United States. But when weeks passed with no word, his mother grew worried. She knew her son. He would never let so much time go by without contact. By June, Denise flew to Canada to search for her son herself. Her arrival marked the beginning of a decades-long quest for answers. Then she retraced his steps, visiting the campground where he'd last been seen, speaking with fellow travelers and locals, trying to piece together his final days. What she found was troubling. Witnesses said Charles had been at the tiny tent town campsite, a place known for young travelers and seasonal workers. He had been social, meeting people, talking freely, but then suddenly he was gone. His belongings, including clothes, sleeping bag, and personal items, were left behind. The only thing missing was him. Police were reluctant at first. They suggested Charles might have wandered off or chosen to disappear. After all, he was an adult, but Denise refused to accept that. She knew something terrible had happened. Her son would not abandon his family, would not vanish without a word. As she pressed harder, she uncovered rumors that haunted her. Some suggested Charles had been caught up in a violent altercation at the campsite. Others whispered he may have been killed and his body disposed of in Okanagan Lake, but no evidence ever surfaced. The years that followed became a relentless cycle of hope and heartbreak for Denise. Every tip, every possible lead she pursued with unwavering determination. She traveled across Canada, appeared on television programs, spoke to reporters, anything to keep Charles's case alive. She believed someone out there knew the truth, and she would not rest until she found it. But as time stretched on, the silence grew heavier. Police conducted searches of the lake, interviews with known associates, and reviews of the few belongings Charles had left behind. Nothing revealed what had happened. Theories swirled endlessly. Was Charles the victim of foul play? Did he stumble into an accident in the rugged terrain surrounding Kelowna? Or was there a darker story, one involving people at the campsite who didn't want the truth revealed? What made Charles's case so haunting was the cruel limbo it left his family in. His mother described it as living in two worlds at once, one where her son was alive out there somewhere, and one where he had been taken from her in violence. Every phone call, every knock at the door carried the weight of possibility. Decades later, the case remains open. Denise continued her search until her death in 2017, never finding the answers she so desperately sought. To this day, Charles's fate is unknown. His face is frozen in time, forever a young man of 20 smiling in photographs, his life cut short in ways no one can fully explain. For Kelowna, the case has lingered as one of its most enduring mysteries. Residents still remember the boy who vanished from their campground, the mother who crossed oceans to find him, and the chilling silence that has surrounded the case ever since. For Canada, Charles's disappearance stands as a reminder of how easily a person can slip into the void, how quickly hope can turn into grief. The haunting question of Charles Horvath-Allan's story is not just what happened to him, but why no one has ever come forward with the truth. In a campground full of people, in a city that buzzed with activity, a young man vanished without a trace. Someone, somewhere, must know the answer. But for more than 3 decades, that answer has remained buried in shadows. The most terrifying part is not just that Charles disappeared, but that he could have been any young traveler, carefree, hopeful, trusting. His story resonates because it reflects the vulnerability of youth, the danger that lurks even in places that seem safe, and the unbearable ache of a mother who died without knowing her son's fate. And so his name remains on the list of Canada's missing, a ghostly reminder that sometimes the truth is not simply lost, it is deliberately hidden. until the day someone steps forward or evidence surfaces from the depths of Okanagan Lake. Charles's story will remain one of Canada's most haunting unsolved mysteries. On a damp spring morning in 1983, the streets of Toronto stirred with their usual rhythm, commuters rushing to work, children hurrying to school, shopkeepers lifting shutters and sweeping sidewalks. Among the many faces in the city was that of 9-year-old Christine Jessup, a bright and lively girl who had spent her early childhood in Queensville, a small town north of Toronto. She was the kind of child who loved to laugh, who adored her family, and who filled her days with simple joys, riding her bike, playing with friends, and helping her mother around the house. On October 3rd of that year, Christine left her home after school. She was supposed to meet a friend for a play date, but she never arrived. Hours passed and her family grew frantic. By evening, when she still had not returned, panic set in. The Jessups called the police, and a search began that stretched late into the night, with neighbors and officers combing fields, roadsides, and wooded areas around the small town. But Christine was nowhere to be found. For weeks, hope carried her family forward. They imagined she might turn up alive, maybe taken, but still reachable. But on December 31st, 1984, 3 months after she disappeared, Christine's body was discovered in a rural area near Sunderland, Ontario, more than 50 kilometers from her home. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered. For her family, the discovery was devastating. For the town, it shattered the fragile sense of safety that children could move freely in their neighborhoods without fear. The police investigation moved quickly at first. Detectives zeroed in on a family friend, a young man named Guy Paul Morin, who lived next door. Morin was quiet, reserved, an introvert who spent his evenings practicing the clarinet. His differences, his solitary nature, made him stand out. And in the court of public opinion, that was enough. By 1984, Morin was charged with Christine's murder. The case that followed became one of the most infamous miscarriages of justice in Canadian history. In 1992, after a second trial, Morin was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The community, desperate for closure, latched onto the verdict. But behind the scenes, serious flaws plagued the investigation: contaminated evidence, tunnel vision by investigators, and shaky testimony from witnesses. Then, in 1995, DNA evidence changed everything. With new technology, forensic scientists tested biological material from Christine's case that had been preserved. The results conclusively excluded Guy Paul Morin as the killer. He was exonerated after nearly a decade of wrongful suspicion and imprisonment. His life had been destroyed, his reputation ruined, all because of a desperate system that sought answers too quickly. The revelation was shocking. The true killer of Christine Jessup had remained free the entire time, and worse, because of the wrongful conviction, valuable years had been lost, years in which the real perpetrator could have been found. For Christine's family, the exoneration was bittersweet. On one hand, they understood that Morin had not been the one responsible for their daughter's death. On the other, the case had grown colder than ever. The trail that might have been fresh in 1983 was now more than a decade old. Witnesses had aged, memories had faded, and the evidence had been mishandled. Still, the Ontario police refused to let go. Cold case units revisited Christine's murder again and again, hoping advancements in forensic science would provide the breakthrough they needed. And in 2020, nearly 4 decades after her death, that breakthrough finally came. Using cutting-edge DNA technology and genetic genealogy, investigators identified Christine's killer, Calvin Hoover, a man who had been in Christine's family's circle all along. He had lived in Queensville at the time, was known to the Jessups, and had taken his own life in 2015. The revelation was a gut punch for the Jessup family. The answer they had sought for decades had come too late. Justice was impossible, as Hoover was already dead, but the knowledge brought a kind of closure, however painful. Christine's parents, who had endured years of grief, anger, and frustration with the justice system, finally knew who had stolen their daughter from them. The story of Christine Jessup's murder continues to haunt Canada, not just because of the tragedy of her death, but because of the failures it revealed in the system meant to protect the innocent. An innocent man lost years of his life behind bars. A family lost decades of peace, forced to wonder if they would ever know the truth. And a killer lived freely until his death, never facing the consequences of his actions. For the people of Queensville, Christine's story remains a painful scar. Parents who were children themselves at the time still recall the fear that swept through their town. It was a moment that changed how they saw the world, how they allowed their children to play, how they trusted their neighbors, how they thought about safety. Christine's name became etched into the history of Canadian true crime, a reminder of both the fragility of justice and the importance of never giving up. Even now, Christine's case is studied in law schools, cited in discussions of wrongful convictions, and remembered as a pivotal moment in Canadian forensic history. Her life was short, her death brutal, but her story has reshaped how investigators, lawyers, and communities understand justice. And yet, beneath all the legal analysis and headlines, Christine was just a little girl, a child who loved her family, her friends, and the small-town life that should have kept her safe. The tragedy of her loss lingers not only in the halls of courts and police stations, but in the hearts of those who remember her as she truly was, a vibrant, laughing 9-year-old stolen from the world too soon. Which of these haunting Canadian cases has left the biggest mark on you so far? In the summer of 1995, the city of Thunder Bay, Ontario, carried the steady rhythm of a northern community, ships docking along Lake Superior, families walking along the waterfront, and students filling classrooms at Lakehead University. It was the kind of city where people still nodded to strangers on the street, where news traveled quickly through neighborhoods. But on June 23rd of that year, the name Tammy Leakey began to circulate in whispers, headlines, and frantic pleas. Tammy was 15 years old, a bright and independent teenager, known for her outgoing personality. She had dreams that stretched beyond Thunder Bay, ambitions that spoke of a future she was eager to chase. That June evening, she was last seen walking near her home. It was supposed to be just another summer night in her neighborhood, the kind where kids roamed freely and returned before dark. But Tammy never came back. By morning, her disappearance had escalated into a citywide search. Her family reported her missing almost immediately, knowing this was out of character. Police responded quickly, canvassing the area and speaking with neighbors. Flyers went up across Thunder Bay, Tammy's photograph staring out from telephone poles and storefronts. Volunteers joined the search, combing wooded trails and checking abandoned lots. For a time, the community clung to hope that she might still be alive. But 3 days later, hope was extinguished. Tammy's body was discovered in a wooded area on the edge of town. She had been brutally assaulted and murdered. The news sent shockwaves through Thunder Bay. Parents pulled their children closer, curfews tightened, and the sense of safety that had defined the community crumbled overnight. The investigation began with urgency. Police gathered evidence from the scene, collected statements from those who had last seen Tammy, and worked to establish a timeline of her final hours. But leads quickly began to dry up. Witnesses reported seeing Tammy walking alone, but no one seemed to know who she might have met or where she might have been headed. As days turned into weeks, frustration grew. The brutality of the crime suggested someone with dangerous impulses, someone who might strike again. But no arrest came. Suspects were questioned and released. Tips poured in, but none provided the breakthrough detectives needed. The case grew colder with each passing year, despite the determination of investigators who refused to let Tammy's file fade into the background. For Tammy's family, the pain was immeasurable. They had lost not only a daughter, but also the future she carried with her, the milestones she would never reach, the laughter that would never return to their home. They worked tirelessly to keep her memory alive, speaking publicly, demanding justice, and pressing for answers. But as the years stretched on, their grief was compounded by the silence of an unsolved crime. Thunder Bay itself was shaken deeply. In a city where violent crime was rare, Tammy's murder became a defining moment. People who had once felt secure in their neighborhoods now looked over their shoulders. Children who once played freely in the streets were suddenly guarded. The trust that had once bound the community together fractured under the weight of fear. Cold case investigators revisited Tammy's murder repeatedly, holding on to the evidence collected in 1995 with the hope that advancements in forensic science might one day reveal her killer. DNA technology has since advanced far beyond what was possible at the time, and investigators continue to test and retest evidence, looking for the match that might finally provide answers. Yet, to this day, no one has been charged. The haunting nature of Tammy's story lies in its suddenness. One moment, she was a teenager walking through her neighborhood. The next, she was gone. Her murder was not just the loss of a young life, but a fracture in the sense of community safety. Every parent who remembers that summer still feels the weight of it. Every child who grew up in Thunder Bay during those years carries the memory of warnings, curfews, and fear. Her name remains on the list of Ontario's cold cases, her face still appearing in occasional media coverage, her story still whispered by those who remember. For her family, the waiting continues. They live with the unbearable knowledge that someone out there knows the truth, that somewhere, perhaps even within their own community, lies the secret of who killed Tammy Leakey. And so her story endures, not just as a tragedy, but as a reminder of how quickly innocence can be stolen, how deeply one crime can scar a city, and how decades later, silence can be just as cruel as the crime itself. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone.